Reach into your refrigerator right now. Middle shelf, door rack, somewhere near the mustard, there it is. That octagonal glass bottle with the Keystone label. You've bought it 100 times without thinking. Heinz isn't just a brand, it's the only brand that matters in ketchup. The company commands 60% of American tables and 650 million bottles sold annually across 140 countries. When restaurants run out, customers complain. When grocery stores stock alternatives, they gather dust. Heinz didn't just win the ketchup wars, it became ketchup itself. But every empire has a foundation, and this one was built on failure, obsession, and ruthless control. The man who started it went bankrupt. The workers who built it were crushed. The communities that housed it were poisoned. And somehow, the brand still wins. Henry John Heinz was born in 1844 in Birmingham, a grimy Pittsburgh suburb where German immigrant families worked themselves to death in brick kilns and steel mills. His father, John Henry Heinz, had crossed the Atlantic with nothing and landed in western Pennsylvania just as the Industrial Revolution was turning the region into a smoke-choked engine of American manufacturing. The family spoke German at home. They scraped by. And from the moment Henry could walk, he worked. At 8 years old, Henry was hauling bricks in his father's kilns. The work was brutal, the kind that warps childhood into something hard and calculating. But Henry wasn't just muscle. He was obsessed with systems, with efficiency, with finding edges. By age 12, he was selling surplus vegetables from his mother's garden door to door in Pittsburgh. Not just selling, studying. He learned which housewives bought what, which streets had money, which hours mattered. He kept records in neat columns, tracking every penny. At 16, Henry turned his mother's garden into a commercial operation. He wasn't picking tomatoes for fun. He was running a business, employing day laborers, selling produce to Pittsburgh grocers at scale. By 25, he'd saved enough to launch his first real venture with a partner, L. Clarence Noble. The year was 1869. The product was horseradish. Here's why horseradish mattered. At the time, most companies sold it in opaque green bottles to hide the fact that they were cutting the product with turnip filler, sawdust, whatever bulked up volume and boosted margins. Customers had no idea they were buying garbage. Henry saw the opening, and he sold horseradish in clear glass bottles so you could see the purity. No additives, no fillers, just horseradish. It was a radical move, and it worked. By the early 1870s, Heinz and Noble were pulling in serious revenue. They expanded into pickles, sauerkraut, vinegar. Henry built a processing plant, hired workers, invested in equipment. On paper, everything looked perfect. But Henry had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd overextended, borrowed heavily, and tied the company's cash flow to credit sales that wouldn't come due for months. Then, in 1873, the financial panic hit. The Panic of 1873 was one of the worst economic collapses in American history. Banks failed. Credit froze. Companies that had been thriving went under in weeks. Heinz and Noble tried to ride it out, but by 1875, the walls closed in. Customers couldn't pay. Creditors demanded their money. The company was bleeding cash with no way to stop it. On December 17, 1875, Heinz and Noble filed for bankruptcy. Henry was 31 years old, and his name was Mud. In the tight-knit business community of Pittsburgh, bankruptcy wasn't just financial failure. It was moral disgrace. People whispered when he walked by. Creditors hounded him. His partner, Noble, wanted nothing to do with him. The humiliation was total. But here's where the story pivots, because most men in Henry's position would have stayed down. They would have taken a factory job, faded into obscurity, spent the rest of their lives nursing bitterness over what might have been. Not Henry. He didn't just want to recover, he wanted to dominate. The bankruptcy didn't break him, it radicalized him. Within months, Henry was plotting his comeback, and he couldn't start a company himself, not legally. Bankruptcy laws at the time barred him from certain business activities, so he did something ruthless and clever. He recruited his brother John and cousin Frederick to be the official owners of a new company. On paper, they ran it. In reality, Henry controlled everything. The company was called F and J Heinz, and it launched in 1876 with Henry pulling the strings from the shadows. He needed a product that would rebuild his reputation, something that screamed quality and purity in a market drowning in adulterated garbage. He chose ketchup, not the thin, brownish slop most companies sold. Real ketchup. Thick, red, made from actual tomatoes without the coal tar dyes and sodium benzoate preservatives that competitors use to cut costs and extend shelf life. At the time, ketchup wasn't even a major product category. It was a condiment people made at home or bought as an afterthought. Most commercial ketchup tasted like vinegar mixed with tomato paste, and it came in bottles you couldn't see through because manufacturers didn't want you looking too closely. Henry saw the same opportunity he'd seen with horseradish. Transparency equals trust. Quality equals premium pricing. He designed a clear glass bottle so customers could see the product. He refused to use preservatives, which meant the ketchup had to be made from ripe tomatoes processed immediately at peak freshness. This was insanely expensive and logistically complicated compared to competitors who used green tomatoes, chemical shortcuts, and shelf-stable additives. But Henry bet that customers would pay more for a product they could trust. The ketchup was thick enough to cling to food, rich enough to taste like actual tomatoes, and came in a bottle that announced its purity before you even opened it. Henry priced it higher than competitors and marketed it as a premium product. And it sold. Not just sold, it moved. Grocers reordered. Customers asked for it by name. By 1888, Henry had paid off every single debt from the 1875 bankruptcy. Not just the legal minimums, every penny with interest. He tracked down creditors personally and handed them checks. It wasn't required. It was a statement. Henry Heinz doesn't stay down. Henry Heinz pays his debts and comes back stronger. In 1888, he reorganized the company again, this time under his own name. F and J Heinz became the H.J. Heinz Company. No more hiding behind brothers and cousins. His name, his empire. The man who'd been bankrupt and humiliated 13 years earlier now controlled a growing food processing operation with ketchup as its flagship product. Then came the marketing masterstroke that would turn Heinz into a cultural phenomenon. In 1896, Henry was riding an elevated train in New York City when he saw an advertisement for a shoe company boasting 21 styles. The number stuck in his head. Not the shoes, the number. He started thinking about his own product line. At the time, Heinz sold more than 60 different products. But 60 didn't sound catchy. It didn't have rhythm. So Henry invented a number, 57. No logic, no connection to reality. He just liked how it sounded. 57 varieties became the company slogan. Stamped on every label, painted on every delivery wagon, plastered across advertisements in every major city. It was pure fiction marketed as fact, and it worked like magic. Customers assumed Heinz had exactly 57 products, which suggested both abundance and precision. The number became iconic, a piece of American advertising folklore that had zero basis in truth. By 1900, the H.J. Heinz Company was producing over 1 million bottles of ketchup per year. The factories in Pittsburgh's North Side were expanding, swallowing entire city blocks. Henry wasn't just selling condiments, he was building an empire, one bottle at a time. The man who'd failed spectacularly at 31 was now, at 56, one of the most successful food manufacturers in America. But success didn't soften him. If anything, It made him more ruthless. Henry obsessed over every detail of production. He personally inspected factories. He fired workers for the smallest sloppiness and demanded cost-cutting at every level. The public image was purity and quality. The private reality was relentless efficiency and control. Workers weren't employees. They were costs to be minimized. The horseradish failure had taught Henry one lesson he never forgot. Never lose control. Never trust partners. Never stop grinding. The empire he was building wouldn't collapse like the first one did. He'd make sure of it, no matter what it took. The obsession started with the bottle. Henry didn't just want a container for ketchup. He wanted a signature, something customers would recognize from across a grocery store. In 1890, he designed what would become one of the most iconic packages in American history, the octagonal bottle. 8-sided, narrow-necked, made from clear glass that showed off the thick red product inside. Most competitors still used round bottles, opaque containers, anything that hid what they were selling. Henry did the opposite. The octagonal shape made the bottle instantly recognizable. The clear glass screamed confidence. If you had nothing to hide, you used glass you could see through. If your ketchup was pure, you wanted customers looking at it. But there was a problem with purity, and it was expensive as hell. Ketchup without preservatives meant you had to use ripe tomatoes, process them immediately, and maintain strict sanitation standards throughout production. Competitors using sodium benzoate could stretch their batches, use underripe or borderline rotten tomatoes, and keep the product shelf-stable for months. Henry's preservative-free ketchup required perfect timing, perfect tomatoes, and perfect execution, so he built a system to guarantee it. He couldn't rely on outside suppliers bringing him garbage tomatoes and expecting premium prices. He needed control over the entire supply chain, from seed to bottle. In the 1890s, Heinz began buying farmland in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. Not leasing, buying. Thousands of acres dedicated solely to growing tomatoes for Heinz Ketchup. The company didn't just own the land. They controlled the seeds. Heinz agricultural researchers developed proprietary tomato varieties bred for thickness, color, and flavor. These weren't heirloom tomatoes or random cultivars. They were industrial crops engineered to produce consistent ketchup at scale. Farmers who wanted to sell to Heinz had to use Heinz seeds, follow Heinz planting schedules, and meet Heinz quality standards. The vertical integration went deeper. Heinz built its own glass bottle factory in Pittsburgh to produce the octagonal bottles, no more depending on outside suppliers who might run short or jack up prices during peak season. Heinz owned the glassworks, controlled the molds, and cranked out millions of bottles per year designed specifically for their product. They built their own vinegar distillery because ketchup is essentially spiced tomato concentrate suspended in vinegar. Buying vinegar from suppliers meant accepting whatever quality they provided and paying their markup. Making it in-house meant perfect consistency and lower costs. The distillery processed 100,000 gallons per month by 1895. Then there was transportation. Heinz built railroad spur lines directly into the factory complex so raw materials could arrive and finished products could ship without ever touching a public road. The company owned its own fleet of delivery wagons, painted bright red with Heinz 57 varieties in bold letters. These wagons became rolling advertisements, impossible to miss as they rumbled through city streets delivering ketchup to grocers. By 1900, the H.J. Heinz Company wasn't just making ketchup. It was a self-contained manufacturing ecosystem. The tomatoes grew on Heinz land from Heinz seeds. They were picked by Heinz workers, processed in Heinz factories, bottled in Heinz-made glass, preserved with Heinz distilled vinegar, and delivered in Heinz wagons. Every step controlled, every margin maximized. The Pittsburgh factory complex sprawled across the north side like an industrial organism. The main building was a massive brick structure, 6 stories tall, stretching an entire city block. Inside, the production line flowed with brutal efficiency. Raw tomatoes entered on the ground floor. They were washed, sorted, and sent to the cooking vats on the second floor. The third floor handled blending and spicing. The fourth floor was bottling. The fifth floor was labeling and packing. The sixth floor stored finished products waiting for shipment. The scale was staggering. By 1905, the factory was processing 40 tons of tomatoes per day during peak season. That's 80,000 pounds of raw fruit moving through the facility every 24 hours, transformed into ketchup, bottled, labeled, and packed for distribution. The factory operated 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours per shift. The machines never stopped. Henry walked the floors constantly, inspecting everything. He'd show up unannounced, run his finger along surfaces checking for dust, taste products straight from the vats, and fire workers on the spot if anything was off. He wasn't a distant owner. He was a tyrant micromanaging every detail. Quality wasn't a goal. It was an obsession that bordered on pathological. The marketing kept pace with production. In 1893, Heinz rented a booth at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But the booth wasn't on the main floor where foot traffic was heaviest. It was stuck on an upper level that most visitors skipped. Henry needed a way to drive people upstairs, so he invented a promotion that became legendary. He printed thousands of small cards advertising Heinz's free pickle pin and hired boys to hand them out on the main floor. The cards directed people to the upstairs booth where they could claim a free souvenir, a small metal pin shaped like a pickle with Heinz stamped on it. It was cheap to produce, cost maybe a penny per pin, but the psychology was perfect. People love free things, especially souvenirs from a World's Fair. The promotion worked beyond anyone's wildest projections. Over the course of the exposition, Heinz gave away more than 1 million pickle pins. 1 million. People wore them on their lapels, on their hats, on their coats. Every pin was a walking advertisement. The pins became collectibles, status symbols, proof you'd been to the fair and visited the Heinz booth. It was guerrilla marketing before the term existed, and it cemented Heinz as a household name. Henry understood something most businessmen missed. Branding isn't about the product. It's about the feeling. The octagonal bottle, the clear glass, the 57 varieties slogan, the pickle pins, all of it created an emotional connection. Heinz wasn't just ketchup. It was quality, purity, American ingenuity. It was the brand your mother bought, so you bought it too. By 1900, Heinz was producing 14 different product lines: ketchup, pickles, vinegar, mustard, baked beans, soups, olives, preserves, and more. But ketchup was the king. It outsold everything else combined. The thick red condiment that Henry had bet on in 1876 was now the foundation of a multi-million-dollar empire. The workforce grew with the factories. By 1905, Heinz employed over 2,500 people in Pittsburgh alone. Most were immigrants, Italians, Poles, Eastern Europeans who'd come to America looking for work and found it in the relentless churn of Heinz production lines. They worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week. The pay was low but steady. The work was repetitive, exhausting, sometimes dangerous. Henry's public image, though, was spotless. He was a devout Christian, a Sunday school teacher, a philanthropist who gave to churches and charities. Newspapers called him a model employer, a captain of industry who cared about his workers. The reality was more complicated, but that story would come later. For now, in the first decade of the 1900s, everything Henry touched turned to gold. The ketchup flowed. The money piled up. The empire expanded. And the man who'd gone bankrupt at 31 stood at the center of it all, controlling every detail, trusting no one, and building something that looked unstoppable. Henry Heinz had a problem that most businessmen would kill for. He was making too much money, and people were starting to ask questions, not about legality, about morality. In the early 1900s, American factory owners were under siege. Muckraking journalists were exposing child labor, 12-hour shifts, starvation wages, and workplace death traps. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had just horrified the nation with its depiction of meatpacking plants, where workers lost fingers and fell into rendering vats. The public was turning against industrialists, viewing them as robber barons who built empires on the backs of exploited workers. Henry needed to get ahead of that narrative, and he did it with a brilliantly calculated public relations campaign that positioned him as the opposite of those villains. The benevolent capitalist who actually cared about his employees. In 1906, Heinz opened the factory to public tours, not just investors or business partners, regular people, housewives, students, church groups. Anyone who wanted to see how ketchup was made could walk right in. This was radical. Most factories were fortresses, closed to outsiders because owners didn't want people seeing the conditions inside. Henry threw the doors open. The tours were carefully choreographed theater. Visitors entered through a grand lobby with polished floors and potted plants. They were led through the cleanest, brightest sections of the factory, where white uniformed workers operated gleaming machinery. The tour guides emphasized sanitation, quality control, and the company's commitment to purity. Everything sparkled. Everything smelled like vinegar and spices instead of sweat and machine oil. Then came the facilities that made headlines. Heinz built a roof garden on top of the main factory building, where workers could eat lunch surrounded by flowers and fresh air instead of crouching on the factory floor. There was an auditorium for concerts and lectures, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, an in-house hospital with doctors and nurses who treated workers for free, cooking classes for women employees, libraries stocked with books, newspapers ate it up. Articles praised Heinz as a model employer who proved that capitalism could be humane. The factory became a tourist attraction. Between 1906 and 1910, over 20,000 people toured the facility annually. They left convinced that Heinz workers had it better than employees anywhere else in America. The reality was more complicated. The roof garden and the swimming pool were real, but access was limited and conditional. Workers could use the facilities only during designated times, only if their production quotas were met, and only if supervisors approved. Miss a quota, and you lost privileges. Step out of line, and you were banned. The amenities weren't gifts. They were incentives and control mechanisms. The medical care was free, but it also allowed company doctors to determine if workers were fit to return to their jobs. If the doctor said you could work, you worked, regardless of how you felt. Injuries that might have kept someone home became minor inconveniences that got bandaged up so the worker could get back on the line. The real story was in the numbers, and the numbers were ruthless. By 1910, Heinz employed over 4,000 workers in Pittsburgh. The average wage was $9 to $12 per week. That sounds almost reasonable until you break it down. Workers put in 60 hours per week, 10-hour days, 6 days straight. That works out to 15 to 20 cents per hour. You could survive on it? Barely. But there was nothing left over. Women, who made up a significant portion of the workforce, earned even less, $7 to $9 per week for the same hours. The company justified this by claiming women's work was lighter and less skilled, which was bullshit. Women worked the bottling lines, the labeling stations, the packing departments. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and required precision. They just got paid less because they were women. The production quotas were insane. Workers on the bottling line had to fill, cap and label a specific number of bottles per hour or face disciplinary action. The pace was relentless. Bathroom breaks were monitored. Talking was discouraged. Supervisors prowled the floors, watching for slowdowns or mistakes. If you couldn't keep up, someone else would take your spot tomorrow. Then there was the piece rate system for certain jobs. Instead of hourly wages, workers got paid per unit produced. Fill 1,000 bottles, earn X dollars. The theory was that this rewarded hard work. The reality was that it incentivized cutting corners, skipping breaks, and working yourself into exhaustion because your pay depended on volume. Piece rate workers often made less than hourly employees because the quotas were set impossibly high. The safety conditions weren't as bad as some factories, but they weren't good either. The bottling machines could catch fingers if you weren't careful. The cooking vats released steam that scalded workers who got too close. The factory floors were slick with spilled tomato pulp and vinegar. Injuries happened regularly. Most were minor: cuts, burns, sprains. But some workers lost fingers or suffered permanent damage. Henry's obsession with quality extended to controlling every aspect of worker behavior. The company had rules for everything: how you dressed, how you wore your hair, how you spoke to supervisors. There were fines for tardiness, fines for talking back, fines for failing to meet quotas. The fines came straight out of paychecks, and the company made damn sure workers stayed dependent. Heinz offered company housing for employees, small apartments near the factory. The rent was deducted automatically from paychecks. If you lost your job, you lost your housing. The company also ran a store where workers could buy groceries and household goods on credit. The credit terms were designed to keep workers perpetually in debt to the company. This wasn't welfare capitalism. It was a trap disguised as generosity. The roof garden, the swimming pool, the hospital, all of it created the illusion that Heinz cared. But underneath, the system was designed to extract maximum labor for minimum cost, while keeping workers too dependent and too controlled to push back. Still, compared to the nightmare conditions in steel mills and coal mines, Heinz looked good. The factory was cleaner. The hours were slightly better. The amenities, limited as they were, actually existed. And workers in other industries looked at Heinz employees with envy. The public saw Henry as a progressive hero, and Henry played the role perfectly, giving speeches about the dignity of labor and the responsibility of employers, while quietly squeezing every ounce of productivity from his workforce. By 1914, the H.J. Heinz Company was an industrial colossus. The Pittsburgh factory complex had grown to over 20 buildings covering dozens of acres. Production had exploded to over 20 million bottles of ketchup per year. The company employed over 6,000 workers in the United States alone, and had opened additional facilities in England to serve the European market. The brand was everywhere. Heinz ketchup sat on tables in diners, restaurants, and homes across America. The 57 varieties slogan was part of the national vocabulary. The octagonal bottle was instantly recognizable. Heinz had achieved something extraordinary: product category dominance. When people wanted ketchup, they didn't think about brands. They thought Heinz. Henry was 65 years old, one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, and a pillar of the Pittsburgh community. He'd built an empire from nothing, survived bankruptcy, and created a brand that would outlive him by over a century. The immigrant kid who'd hauled bricks at age 8 now controlled a multinational corporation. But empires don't run on nostalgia. They run on ruthless efficiency, controlled labor, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to maintain dominance. Henry understood that better than anyone. The factory tours and the roof gardens were window dressing. The real foundation of the Heinz empire was thousands of workers grinding through 60-hour weeks for wages that kept them alive but never free. The Gilded Age was about to crash into World War I, and Heinz, like every American manufacturer, would pivot to serve the war machine. The empire was about to get even bigger. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, American manufacturers saw opportunity. The United States wouldn't officially enter the war until 1917, but that didn't stop companies from ramping up production to supply the Allies. Heinz was no exception. The war would prove to be the most profitable period in the company's history, transforming it from a dominant domestic brand into a global powerhouse. Henry J. Heinz died in 1919, but his son Howard took over and ran the company with the same obsessive attention to detail his father had demanded. The transition was seamless. Under Howard's leadership during the war years, Heinz secured massive contracts to supply the U.S. military with canned goods, ketchup, baked beans, and pickled vegetables. Soldiers in trenches across France were eating Heinz products, and when they came home, they kept buying them. The war contracts were lucrative as hell. The government paid premium prices and ordered in quantities that dwarfed civilian demand. Between 1917 and 1918, Heinz production exploded. The Pittsburgh factories ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The workforce swelled beyond 8,000 employees. Every available space was converted to production. The company printed money while soldiers died in mud. But the war did something else. It exported American culture. Troops stationed overseas encountered Heinz products in their mess kits, and then introduced them to locals in England, France, and Belgium. After the war, those countries wanted to keep buying Heinz. The brand became associated with American quality, American abundance, American modernity. It was the taste of the nation that had helped win the war. In 1919, Heinz opened a massive manufacturing facility in Harlesden, England, just outside London. The plant covered 18 acres and employed over 3,000 workers at its peak. It produced ketchup, baked beans, and soups tailored to British tastes. The factory became one of the largest food processing plants in Europe, and it cemented Heinz's position as a truly multinational corporation. By the mid-1920s, Heinz products were available in over 40 countries: Australia, South Africa, India, Canada, throughout Europe. The octagonal bottle became a symbol of American industrial might. The 57 varieties slogan translated into dozens of languages. Heinz wasn't just selling ketchup. It was selling the American dream, bottled and exported. The advertising got more sophisticated and more aggressive. Heinz pioneered the use of billboards, placing massive painted signs along highways and railroad lines. The company bought full-page magazine ads in publications like the Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal. Radio advertising emerged in the 1920s, and Heinz was an early adopter, sponsoring programs and running jingles that burrowed into listeners' brains. The marketing messaging was relentless and consistent: purity, quality, trust. Every ad emphasized that Heinz products contained no artificial preservatives, no harmful additives, just pure ingredients. This was a powerful message in an era when food safety scandals regularly made headlines. Heinz positioned itself as the safe choice, the brand mothers could trust to feed their families. By 1930, Heinz controlled an estimated 65% of the American ketchup market. The competition wasn't even close. Brands like Del Monte and Hunt's existed, but they were fighting for scraps. Heinz had won. The company produced over 60 million bottles of ketchup annually in the United States alone, with additional millions coming from the English factory. The production scale required unprecedented logistics. Heinz operated over 30,000 acres of company-owned farmland dedicated to tomatoes, cucumbers, and other vegetables. During peak harvest season, the company employed thousands of seasonal workers who picked, sorted, and transported produce to processing facilities. These weren't full-time employees. They were migrant laborers, often entire families, who worked brutal hours for piece-rate wages. The harvests were timed with military precision. Tomatoes had to be picked at peak ripeness and processed within hours to maintain quality. That meant the factories operated at maximum capacity for 6 to 8 weeks every summer, crushing through hundreds of tons of tomatoes per day. Workers pulled 16-hour shifts during harvest season. The pace was inhuman, but the company demanded it. Back in Pittsburgh, the main factory complex had grown into an industrial city within a city. By 1935, the Heinz facility covered over 70 acres and included more than 30 buildings. There was the original main factory, now expanded to 8 stories, the glass bottle plant, the vinegar distillery, the warehouses, the power plant that generated steam and electricity for the entire operation. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the property, connecting everything. The architectural centerpiece was the administration building, completed in 1906, installing a magnificent brick structure with ornate details and a tower that dominated the Pittsburgh skyline. It wasn't just functional, it was a statement. Heinz had arrived. The company that started in a rented workshop now owned one of the most impressive industrial campuses in America. Inside, the production lines had evolved into mechanized marvels. Automated washing systems cleaned tomatoes. Steam-powered cookers processed thousands of pounds per hour. Bottling machines filled, capped, and labeled bottles at speeds that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The factory wasn't just big, it was a machine, fine-tuned to produce ketchup at a scale that crushed any competitor who tried to keep up. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and most American companies collapsed or barely survived. Not Heinz. Ketchup is cheap, a little luxury that even struggling families could afford. A bottle cost 15 cents and lasted for weeks. During the Depression, Heinz sales actually held steady. People might not be able to afford meat every day, but they could afford ketchup to make their potatoes and rice more palatable. The company's financial stability during the Depression reinforced its dominance. Competitors went bankrupt or sold out. Heinz bought up failed facilities and absorbed their market share. By 1935, Heinz's market control had climbed to 70%. The Depression didn't hurt Heinz. It eliminated the competition. The workforce in Pittsburgh during this period hovered around 5,000 to 6,000 permanent employees, with thousands more seasonal workers during harvest. The wages remained low, but in the Depression, having any job was a blessing. Workers stayed silent about conditions because the alternative was unemployment and starvation. Heinz exploited that desperation, keeping wages flat while profits grew. Then came World War II, and everything exploded again. In 1941, the United States entered the war, and Heinz immediately pivoted to military production. The government contracts were even larger than in World War I. The company supplied ketchup, baked beans, soups, and canned vegetables to U.S. troops in Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, everywhere American soldiers fought. Production went into overdrive. The Pittsburgh factory operated around the clock. Every available worker was hired. Women filled jobs left by men who'd enlisted. Teenagers worked after school. The company ran recruitment ads promising patriotic service and steady wages. By 1943, Heinz employed over 9,000 people in the United States alone. The war years were obscenely profitable. The government paid cost-plus contracts, meaning Heinz got reimbursed for production costs plus a guaranteed profit margin. There was no competitive bidding, no price pressure. The contracts were lucrative, stable, and massive. Heinz made more money during the war than in any previous period in its history, but there was a cost, and the workers paid it. Wartime wage controls meant the company couldn't raise pay even as inflation climbed. Workers' real wages actually decreased during the war while the company's profits soared. The disconnect was brutal. Employees watched the factory churn out record production, watched management get bonuses, and saw their own paychecks buy less every month. In 1943, tensions boiled over, and workers at the Pittsburgh plant began organizing quietly at first, then openly. They wanted higher wages to match the wartime inflation. They wanted safer conditions in factories running at unsustainable speeds. They wanted recognition that they were the ones keeping the empire running while executives got rich. The company fought back hard. Management brought in anti-union consultants. They fired suspected organizers. They held mandatory meetings where supervisors warned that unions would destroy jobs and hurt the war effort. The message was clear: stay in line or lose everything. The union drive stalled during the war because nobody wanted to be seen as unpatriotic. Striking during wartime was career suicide and social suicide. The workers swallowed their anger and kept producing. But the resentment didn't disappear. It festered, waiting for the war to end. By 1945, when the war ended, Heinz had achieved something extraordinary. The brand was in every American home and in homes across dozens of countries. Production capacity had grown beyond anything Henry Heinz could have imagined. The company employed tens of thousands worldwide. Annual revenue topped $100 million. Heinz wasn't just a ketchup company. It was a food processing empire. The soldiers who came home had eaten Heinz ketchup in mess halls from Normandy to Okinawa. It was comfort food, a taste of home in the middle of hell. When they returned to civilian life, they bought Heinz because it reminded them of survival, of making it through. The brand had embedded itself into the American psyche at a level that transcended mere preference. But the empire was built on a foundation that was starting to crack. The workers who'd been silenced during the war were ready to speak. The markets that looked infinite were approaching saturation. The business model that had worked for 70 years was about to face challenges it wasn't designed to handle. The golden age was ending, and nobody in the Heinz boardroom saw it coming. The strike came in January 1946, barely 4 months after the war ended. Over 3,000 workers at the Pittsburgh Heinz plant walked off the job, shutting down production completely. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was organized, deliberate, and backed by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, one of the most powerful labor federations in America. The workers had 3 core demands. First, wage increases to match wartime inflation. Prices had climbed 30% during the war while wages stayed frozen. Workers needed raises just to get back to where they'd been in 1941. Second, an end to the piece rate system that forced employees to work at inhuman speeds for unpredictable pay. Third, union recognition. They wanted a contract, collective bargaining rights, and protection from arbitrary firings. Heinz management refused all 3. The company issued a statement claiming the demands were unreasonable, that the business couldn't sustain higher wages, and that unions would destroy the family atmosphere that made Heinz special. The irony was thick. The family atmosphere included mandatory 60-hour weeks, wages that hadn't kept pace with inflation, and supervisors who ruled the factory floor like tyrants. The strike lasted 7 weeks. Picket lines formed outside the factory gates. Workers carried signs reading, "Heinz workers deserve a living wage," and 57 varieties of exploitation. The local newspapers covered it extensively. Public opinion was mixed. Some saw the workers as ungrateful troublemakers. Others saw them as Americans fighting for fair treatment after sacrificing during the war. Management tried to break the strike by hiring replacement workers, but the picket lines held. Scabs who crossed faced social ostracism in the tight-knit Pittsburgh neighborhoods where most Heinz workers lived. The factory limped along at maybe 20% capacity, not enough to meet orders. Ketchup shipments slowed to a trickle. Grocery stores started running low on Heinz products for the first time in decades. In March 1946, the company finally caved. They agreed to a 15% wage increase, phased elimination of the piece rate system, and union recognition. The workers went back, and production resumed. It looked like a victory, and in some ways it was. But the strike left scars. Management resented the workers for forcing their hand. Workers resented management for fighting so hard against basic fairness. The family atmosphere was dead. Behind the scenes, company executives started planning for a future where labor couldn't disrupt operations. That meant automation, replace workers with machines wherever possible, reduce headcount, eliminate the leverage that made strikes effective. It would take years to implement, but the decision was made in 1946. The workforce was a problem to be solved. While labor relations festered, another issue was growing quietly in the background: environmental damage. For 70 years, Heinz had been dumping industrial waste into the Allegheny River and nearby waterways. Tomato pulp, vinegar runoff, chemical cleaning agents, all of it flowed straight from the factory into the river. Nobody cared. That's what rivers were for in industrial America: free waste disposal. By the late 1940s, the Allegheny River near the Heinz plant was biologically dead. Fish couldn't survive. The water smelled like rotting vegetables and vinegar. A thick scum floated on the surface. In summer, the stench was unbearable for people living nearby. But Heinz was a major employer and a source of civic pride. Complaining about pollution meant risking jobs, so people kept quiet. The soil around the factory was contaminated too. Decades of spills, leaks, and improper disposal had saturated the ground with industrial chemicals. Lead from the solder used in canning operations, heavy metals from the machinery, petroleum products from the trucks and equipment. It all leached into the soil and groundwater, creating a toxic zone that would take generations to clean up. But in the 1940s and 50s, environmental regulations didn't exist. The Environmental Protection Agency wouldn't be created until 1970. When companies could dump whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted, with zero consequences. Heinz wasn't unique in this. Every industrial operation in America did the same thing. The difference was scale. Heinz was one of the largest food processors in the country, which meant the volume of waste was staggering. The post-war years also revealed a fundamental business problem that Heinz hadn't anticipated: market saturation. By 1950, Heinz Ketchup was in over 80% of American households. That sounds like total victory, and it was. But it also meant there was nowhere left to grow. Everyone who wanted Heinz already had Heinz. The explosive growth of the previous 50 years was over. The company tried to push into new product categories. In the 1950s, Heinz launched baby food, competing directly with Gerber. They introduced new soup varieties, frozen foods, and instant meals, trying to capitalize on the post-war convenience food boom. Some products succeeded. Most failed. Heinz was so identified with ketchup that consumers didn't trust the brand for other categories. Meanwhile, competitors were learning from Heinz's playbook. Hunt's, Del Monte, and store brands started offering ketchup in similar bottles at lower prices. They couldn't match Heinz's market share, but they chipped away at the margins. By 1960, Heinz's dominance had slipped from 70% to around 50% of the ketchup market. Still number one by a mile, but the trajectory was concerning. The company's response was to double down on marketing. Heinz increased advertising spending, launching television campaigns in the 1950s that became cultural touchstones. The most famous was the "Slowest Ketchup in the West" campaign, which turned the product's thickness, a potential drawback, into a selling point. The ads showed ketchup moving through the bottle at a glacial pace, while a narrator explained that good ketchup doesn't rush. The campaign was brilliant. It reframed a problem as proof of quality. Heinz ketchup was slow because it was thick. It was thick because it was made from real tomatoes without fillers or water. The ads worked. Sales stabilized, the brand identity strengthened, but underneath, the fundamental issues remained: market saturation, rising competition, an aging workforce in outdated factories, environmental damage accumulating like interest on a debt nobody wanted to pay. In 1952, Henry John Heinz II, the founder's grandson, took over as CEO. He'd grown up in the business, worked in the factories. He'd seen and understood the empire better than anyone. But he also saw the challenges. The Pittsburgh plant was 75 years old. The equipment was obsolete. Competitors were building modern facilities with automation that Heinz couldn't match without massive investment. Henry II made a decision that would define the next 2 decades. Instead of modernizing the Pittsburgh plant, the company would build new facilities elsewhere and slowly shift production away from the aging North Side complex. The first new plant opened in Fremont, Ohio in 1954. Modern, automated, designed for efficiency. It could produce ketchup at half the labor cost of Pittsburgh. More plants followed. Tracy, California in 1956. Leamington, Ontario in 1957. Each one more automated, more efficient, requiring fewer workers than the old Pittsburgh operation. The strategy made business sense. Lower costs, higher margins, better positioned for the future. But it also meant the beginning of the end for the Pittsburgh plant that had built the empire. The workers in Pittsburgh saw what was happening. New plants meant production shifting away. Shifting production meant fewer jobs. Fewer jobs meant layoffs. The union tried to fight back, negotiating guarantees that the Pittsburgh plant would remain operational. Management gave vague assurances but made no binding commitments. By 1960, employment at the Pittsburgh facility had dropped from 6,000 to around 4,000. The reductions were gradual, accomplished through attrition and early retirements rather than mass layoffs. But everyone knew the trend. The heart of the Heinz empire was being slowly bled out, replaced by modern facilities in places with cheaper labor and no union history. The environmental damage kept accumulating. The Allegheny River kept getting poisoned. The soil contamination kept spreading. Company executives knew about it. Internal memos from the 1950s show discussions of pollution issues, but the conclusion was always the same. Fixing it would cost too much and wasn't legally required, so why bother? The communities around the factory suffered in silence. Higher rates of respiratory illness, contaminated well water, children playing in soil laced with industrial toxins. Nobody connected the dots, or if they did, they didn't speak up. Heinz was still the largest employer in the area. You didn't bite the hand that fed you, even if that hand was slowly poisoning you. The 1960s brought cultural shifts that threatened Heinz's traditional market. Women were entering the workforce in record numbers, which meant less time for home cooking. Fast food chains were exploding across America, and they negotiated bulk pricing that cut into Heinz's retail margins. Grocery stores started pushing their own store brand ketchup, pricing it 30% below Heinz and stocking it at eye level while Heinz got the bottom shelf. The company fought back with brand loyalty campaigns emphasizing heritage and quality. The advertising message was clear. Heinz isn't just ketchup, it's American tradition. Your grandmother used Heinz. Your mother used Heinz. You use Heinz. The emotional appeal worked on older consumers, but younger shoppers didn't care about tradition. They cared about price. By 1970, Heinz's market share had dropped to 45%. Still dominant, but the decline was accelerating. The company's diversification efforts had produced mixed results. The baby food line never overtook Gerber. Frozen foods faced brutal competition. Heinz was making money, still profitable, but growth had stalled. Wall Street started questioning whether the company had a future beyond ketchup, and ketchup wasn't growing anymore. The Pittsburgh plant kept shrinking. By 1975, employment had fallen below 3,000. Entire sections of the complex sat empty, windows broken, equipment rusting. The factory that had once been a source of civic pride was becoming an eyesore, a reminder of industrial decline. The neighborhoods around it were struggling too. Good jobs disappearing, property values falling, the tax base eroding. Management kept insisting the Pittsburgh plant was essential, but everyone knew it was dying. The writing was on the wall, written in declining employment numbers, reduced production quotas, and the steady shift of operations to newer facilities. The question wasn't if the Pittsburgh plant would close, it was when, and what would happen to the thousands of workers and families who depended on it. The empire that Henry Heinz built with obsessive attention to quality and control was still standing, but it was hollow. The brand survived. The ketchup sold. But the foundation, the workers, the communities, the environment was crumbling. The golden age was over, and what came next would be collapse. The environmental reckoning started quietly in 1972 when Pennsylvania passed its first Clean Streams law. For the first time, companies faced legal consequences for dumping industrial waste into waterways. The law had teeth: fines, cleanup orders, potential criminal charges. Heinz was suddenly looking at decades of pollution that could no longer be ignored. Internal company assessments revealed the scale of contamination. The Allegheny River sediment near the outflow pipes contained toxic concentrations of heavy metals. The soil on factory property was laced with lead, petroleum byproducts, and chemical residues. Groundwater beneath the site had been poisoned to depths of 40 feet. Fixing it would cost millions, maybe tens of millions. The company's response was to do the bare minimum required by law. They installed basic filtration systems for wastewater discharge. They stopped the most egregious dumping practices, but they didn't remediate the existing contamination. That would come later, much later, when the factory was already dead and the cleanup became someone else's problem. Meanwhile, the labor situation kept deteriorating. The 1970s brought inflation that crushed American workers. Prices climbed 10% to 15% per year, while wages lagged far behind. Heinz workers who'd been making decent money in the 1960s found themselves struggling to afford groceries in the 1970s. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, were dropping every year. The union pushed for cost of living adjustments, automatic raises tied to inflation. Management refused. Negotiations turned hostile. In 1974, workers voted to authorize a strike. This time, the company had a backup plan. The newer plants in Ohio and California could absorb most of the Pittsburgh production. A strike wouldn't cripple Heinz anymore. It would just accelerate the shift away from Pittsburgh. The strike didn't happen. The union backed down, accepting a minimal raise that didn't come close to matching inflation. Workers went back to the line bitter and defeated. They knew they'd lost leverage. The company could survive without them now. The balance of power had shifted completely. Automation kept advancing, replacing workers with machines. The bottling lines that once required dozens of workers now ran with 6. The labeling stations went from manual application to automated systems that could process thousands of bottles per hour with no human intervention. Every technological upgrade meant fewer jobs. By 1980, the Pittsburgh plant employed barely 2,000 workers, down from over 6,000 in the 1950s. Production had dropped too, but not proportionally. The facility was producing 60% of its peak output with 1/3 the workforce. The remaining workers worked harder than ever, running machines that demanded constant attention and unforgiving speeds. The factory itself was falling apart. The main building, constructed in the 1870s and expanded in the early 1900s, was over a century old. The roof leaked. The plumbing broke constantly. Electrical systems sparked and failed. Maintenance budgets had been slashed year after year because the company wasn't investing in a facility it planned to abandon. Workers dealt with conditions that would have triggered OSHA violations, except inspections were rare, and easily anticipated. Managers got advance warning. He rushed through cosmetic fixes, and everything looked fine when inspectors arrived. After they left, it went back to broken equipment, dangerous shortcuts, and supervisors who demanded production no matter what. The monopolistic practices that had built Heinz's dominance were also under pressure. Grocery stores in the 1970s started consolidating into national chains with serious negotiating power. They demanded lower wholesale prices and threatened to promote store brands if Heinz didn't comply. The company had to choose between maintaining margins or maintaining shelf space. Heinz cut prices, which cut profits, which meant less money for wages, maintenance, and investment. The financial squeeze tightened every year. Wall Street analysts questioned whether Heinz could compete long-term. The stock price stagnated. Shareholders got restless. In 1978, the company made a desperate play for growth by acquiring Weight Watchers, the diet program and frozen food brand. The logic was that health-conscious consumers represented an expanding market while ketchup was mature. Heinz paid $71 million for Weight Watchers and announced ambitious plans to revolutionize the diet food industry. It didn't work. Heinz had no expertise in diet programs or frozen foods. The company culture built on ketchup production couldn't adapt to a completely different business model. Weight Watchers generated revenue but never delivered the growth Heinz needed. The acquisition was a distraction from the core problems that kept getting worse. Then in 1979, Heinz got caught in a financial scandal that damaged the company's reputation for integrity. Executives had been manipulating earnings reports, moving costs between quarters to smooth out financial results and meet Wall Street expectations. The SEC launched an investigation. Fines were paid. Several executives resigned. The scandal confirmed what many suspected. Beneath the wholesome brand image, Heinz was just another corporation willing to bend rules for profit. The 1980s brought the final descent. Ronald Reagan's administration embraced deregulation and corporate consolidation. Antitrust enforcement collapsed. Companies merged, slashed costs, and pursued short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Heinz followed the trend, acquiring more brands while cutting deeper into its manufacturing base. The Pittsburgh plant was on life support. By 1985, employment had dropped below 1,500. Entire buildings in the complex sat empty. Vandals broke in, stripping copper wiring and anything valuable. Homeless people camped in the abandoned sections. The factory that had once been a cathedral of American industry was becoming an industrial graveyard. The surrounding neighborhood collapsed alongside it. Property values plummeted. Businesses closed. Crime increased. The tax base eroded so much that the city couldn't afford basic services. Street lights went dark. Roads developed potholes that never got fixed. Schools lost funding. The community that Heinz had built was being destroyed by Heinz's retreat. Workers who'd spent their entire careers at the plant saw the end coming. Men in their 50s and 60s, too old to find new jobs, too young for retirement, watched their livelihood disappear. The union could do nothing. The company had all the leverage. Protests wouldn't bring back jobs that had been automated or shifted to other facilities. In 1987, Heinz made it official. The Pittsburgh plant would close permanently by 1990. The announcement was clinical, couched in corporate language about optimization and efficiency. 3 years to wind down operations. After that, 110 years of continuous production would end. The workers still remaining were offered early retirement packages that amounted to pennies compared to what they'd given the company. Take the buyout or wait for the final closure and get nothing. Most took the buyout. They didn't have a choice. The environmental contamination remained untouched. The soil was poisoned. The groundwater was toxic. The river sediment contained heavy metals at concentrations dozens of times above safe levels. Heinz's legal obligation was minimal. They'd stopped active dumping, which satisfied the Clean Water Act. Cleaning up historical contamination wasn't required unless the EPA specifically designated it a Superfund site, which hadn't happened yet. The company's strategy was clear: walk away and let time and bankruptcy proceedings handle the mess. If the property sat abandoned long enough, cleanup costs would eventually fall to taxpayers through federal environmental programs. Heinz would be long gone, immune to liability, while the community dealt with the toxic legacy for generations. The closure finally came in 1990. The last shift ended on a Friday afternoon in March. Workers turned off the machines, clocked out, and walked away from the factory that had defined their lives. No ceremony, no recognition, just silence and locked gates. Within months, the scavenging intensified. Everything valuable was stripped from the buildings: copper piping, brass fittings, steel beams, factory equipment, all of it hauled away and sold for scrap. What remained was a hollow shell, 70 acres of contaminated land, with crumbling buildings that nobody wanted. The human cost was catastrophic. Over 1,000 workers lost their jobs in the final closure. Most were middle-aged or older, with skills specific to food manufacturing that had no transferable value in the new service economy. Unemployment in the surrounding neighborhoods hit 25%. Families that had relied on Heinz paychecks for generations suddenly had nothing. Social services were overwhelmed. Food banks ran out of supplies. Domestic violence increased. Addiction rates skyrocketed as people turned to alcohol and drugs to numb the despair. Suicide rates climbed. The community that Heinz built was dying, and Heinz wasn't there to witness it. The company itself moved on without looking back. By 1990, Heinz had transformed into a diversified food conglomerate with operations in dozens of countries. Ketchup was still the flagship product, but it represented a shrinking percentage of total revenue. The brand was strong. The profits were solid. Wall Street was satisfied. The executives who made the decision to close Pittsburgh got bonuses for cutting costs and improving margins. Shareholders saw stock prices rise. The financial press praised Heinz for tough but necessary restructuring. Nobody in the boardroom lost sleep over the thousands of workers and families whose lives were destroyed. This was the price of purity. The ketchup empire, built on glass bottles and preservative-free recipes, had been sustained by crushing workers, poisoning communities, and extracting everything of value before walking away. The brand survived because it was built to outlast the people who made it. The abandoned Pittsburgh factory became a symbol of American industrial decline. Throughout the 1990s, the buildings rotted, windows shattered, roofs collapsed, graffiti covered the brick walls. Urban explorers wandered through the ruins, photographing the decay, treating it like an archaeological site from a lost civilization, which, in a way, it was. The environmental contamination became impossible to ignore. In 1995, the EPA finally designated portions of the former Heinz property as requiring remediation under Superfund regulations. Soil testing revealed lead concentrations 50 times above safe levels. Groundwater samples showed petroleum contamination extending beneath neighboring properties. The riverbank sediment was classified as hazardous waste. The cleanup estimate came in at $47 million. Heinz, and by then a global corporation with revenues exceeding $9 billion annually, fought the designation. They claimed the contamination predated modern environmental laws and therefore wasn't their responsibility. They argued that other industrial operations in the area contributed to the pollution. They hired lawyers and consultants to delay and minimize their liability. The legal battle dragged on for years. Meanwhile, the contamination spread. Rainwater leached toxins from the soil into the Allegheny River. Groundwater contamination migrated into residential wells. Children in nearby neighborhoods showed elevated blood lead levels. The community paid the price while Heinz's legal team ran out the clock. Eventually, in 2003, a settlement was reached. Heinz agreed to pay $12 million toward cleanup costs, a fraction of the actual expense and an even smaller fraction of the damage caused by 110 years of pollution. The rest came from federal and state environmental funds, which means taxpayers covered the bulk of the cost for cleaning up Heinz's mess. The remediation work started in 2005 and took nearly a decade. Contaminated soil was excavated and hauled to hazardous waste facilities. Groundwater extraction systems were installed to pump and treat poisoned water. The riverbank was dredged, removing sediment so toxic it had to be disposed of as hazardous material. Parts of the site were simply capped with concrete and clay barriers, locking the contamination in place because removing it was too expensive. By 2015, the site was declared remediated, which didn't mean clean. It meant contamination levels had been reduced to acceptable standards, standards that still left some toxins in soil and groundwater at concentrations far above natural background levels. The property could be redeveloped for industrial use, but not residential. No homes, no schools, no parks. The land Heinz poisoned would remain partially toxic forever. While Pittsburgh dealt with environmental disaster, Heinz, the company, kept evolving. The 1990s and 2000s brought waves of mergers, acquisitions, and restructuring. In 2000, Heinz acquired Ore-Ida Frozen Foods. In 2002, they bought the frozen dessert brand Weight Watchers Smart Ones. In 2005, they acquired HP Sauce and Leah and Perrins in the UK. The company kept expanding its portfolio while shrinking its American manufacturing base. More U.S. factories closed. The plant in Tracy, California shut down in 2010, eliminating 350 jobs. The Fremont, Ohio facility, once touted as the modern replacement for Pittsburgh, closed in 2011. Production shifted overseas to facilities in China, Poland, and the Netherlands, where labor was cheaper and environmental regulations were weaker. By 2010, Heinz employed fewer than 3,000 people in the United States, down from over 15,000 in the 1980s. The company still generated billions in revenue and maintained market dominance in ketchup. But it had essentially abandoned American manufacturing. The jobs that built the empire were gone, replaced by automation and offshoring. Then in 2013 came the takeover that transformed Heinz from an American institution into a financial asset. Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's investment firm, partnered with 3G Capital, a Brazilian private equity firm known for ruthless cost-cutting, to buy Heinz for $28 billion. It was one of the largest leverage buyouts in history. 3G Capital took operational control, and they did exactly what everyone expected. They slashed costs with surgical precision. Thousands of jobs disappeared. Marketing budgets were cut. Research and development was gutted. Entire divisions were eliminated. The company that had employed tens of thousands at its peak was carved down to a skeleton crew focused solely on maintaining the brands and maximizing profit margins. In 2015, Heinz merged with Kraft Foods to create the Kraft Heinz Company, the fifth largest food and beverage company in the world. The merger was sold as a combination of equals, but it was really a cost-cutting exercise. Redundant positions were eliminated. Factories were consolidated. Supply chains were optimized. Another 2,500 jobs vanished. Kraft Heinz is now headquartered in Chicago and Pittsburgh, though the Pittsburgh office is a symbolic gesture rather than a meaningful operation. The company employs around 39,000 people worldwide, but only a fraction work in the United States. Manufacturing happens in low-cost countries. Management operates from corporate offices. The workers who built Heinz's empire are gone. The ketchup itself is still everywhere. Heinz still controls about 60% of the U.S. ketchup market and maintains strong positions in Europe and parts of Asia. the octagonal bottle is still instantly recognizable. The brand equity built over 150 years remains powerful. Walk into any diner, any fast food restaurant, any kitchen, and there it is. But the product is divorced from its origin. The ketchup is made in factories that have nothing to do with Pittsburgh, by workers the company views as interchangeable and disposable. The tomatoes come from industrial farms optimized for yield, not quality. The vertical integration that Henry Heinz pioneered is gone, replaced by global supply chains managed by algorithms. The Heinz name means nothing about where the product comes from or who makes it. It's just branding, a logo that triggers recognition and trust based on a history most consumers don't know and wouldn't care about if they did. The story of obsessive quality and purity is marketing fiction. The reality is a commodity product manufactured at the lowest possible cost and sold at the highest price the market will bear. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the Heinz empire? The lessons are brutal and clear. First, market dominance doesn't last. Heinz controlled 70% of the American ketchup market at its peak. That dominance created complacency. The company stopped innovating, stopped adapting, and lost ground to competitors who were leaner and hungrier. No matter how dominant you are today, the market will find someone cheaper, faster, or better. Second, worker welfare is optional until it's forced. Heinz built its reputation on progressive labor practices, but those practices were always about control and public relations, not genuine care. When unions demanded real improvements, the company fought back. When automation made workers redundant, they were discarded without hesitation. Corporations care about labor costs, not laborers. Third, environmental damage is someone else's problem. For over a century, Heinz dumped toxins into rivers and soil without consequence. When regulations finally arrived, the company minimized cleanup costs and shifted the burden to taxpayers. The communities that supported Heinz for generations are still dealing with contamination that will outlast everyone alive today. Fourth, brands outlive empires. The Heinz name survives even though the company that built it is unrecognizable. The ketchup sells because of brand equity accumulated over 150 years, not because of current quality or innovation. A brand can become so powerful that it sustains itself independently of the people, communities, and values that created it. Fifth, globalization destroys local manufacturing. Heinz started as a Pittsburgh company that employed thousands of local workers and contributed to the community. It ended as a multinational conglomerate with no loyalty to place or people. The logic of global capitalism demands moving production to wherever costs are lowest, regardless of the human consequences. The final lesson is the most important. Corporations extract value and leave ruins. Heinz took everything Pittsburgh offered: labor, land, water, community support, and gave back paychecks that kept workers dependent and facilities that poisoned the environment. When profitability demanded it, Heinz walked away, leaving contaminated land, unemployed workers, and shattered communities. The factory that employed thousands is now a brownfield awaiting redevelopment that may never come. The river that was poisoned is partially recovered, but will never be pristine. The neighborhoods that thrived on Heinz paychecks are struggling with poverty, addiction, and decay. The workers who gave their lives to the company got buyouts that barely covered a year's expenses. Heinz, the corporation, is fine. Kraft Heinz generated $26 billion in revenue in 2022. The stock trades on the NASDAQ. Dividends flow to shareholders. The brand is strong. The ketchup sells. None of the executives who closed the Pittsburgh plant or fought environmental cleanup are suffering. They retired with bonuses and pensions. The people who paid the price weren't in boardrooms or shareholder meetings. They were on factory floors, in surrounding neighborhoods, drinking contaminated water and breathing polluted air. They were workers whose skills became obsolete, in families whose stability was destroyed, and communities whose futures were stolen. That's the real story of Heinz, not the heartwarming tale of immigrant success and American innovation, not the marketing mythology of quality and purity. The real story is extraction, exploitation, and abandonment. It's the story of how capitalism builds empires on the backs of workers and communities, then walks away when the profit margins shrink. Henry Heinz started with nothing and built something extraordinary. But what he built was never really about ketchup. It was about control, market dominance, and extracting maximum value from every resource, human and environmental. The empire succeeded brilliantly by those measures. It failed catastrophically by every other measure that matters. The ketchup still sits on tables around the world. The brand still dominates, but the empire is gone, and what it left behind is poisoned land, broken communities, and a lesson about the true cost of industrial success. The bottle is silent, the workers are forgotten, and the tables of the world keep demanding more.